Chapter 187, The Cathedral 3. Within a white room that was completely empty of anything, Christina was kneeling down in the center of the room. The room had no windows, nor did it have any lights. Even so, it wasn't dark. This room was white because the walls themselves were able to emit light. This was the chapel building near the Fount of Light. Christina was familiar with this room but didn't find it the least bit comfortable. The day that she was bestowed with the light, and it first began to dwell within her body, was the first day that Christina had come to the Fount of Light and had entered this room. After 10 years of this, the room had become familiar to her, but it was as uncomfortable as her. The walls shone as softly as ever while she sat in the center of the room and went through the process of preparing for the sacrament. Without doing anything, just sitting there and settling her heart. It was just a repetition of what she had done before. Nothing had changed. Even 10 years ago she had had these sorts of thoughts. Was all this really necessary? Why? Was there any meaning to this? No, there was definitely some meaning. However, was this the right thing to do? Was this truly God's will? Could the saintess really be such an existence? Christina silently repeated such thoughts to herself. She had pondered the same questions dozens, even hundreds of times, but in the end she had still stayed in this room. Compared to the success of the sacrament, the fact that she wasn't able to understand her own role in this was as insignificant as a speck of dust. That was what Christina had been taught ever since she was a child. That was how she had grown up. She had been told of the role of the saintess, and she knew how significant becoming the saintess was. That was something that Christina had never doubted. She lived to become the saint. Christina Rogers's whole life had been dedicated to earning the name of the saint. Now, after everything she had endured for the past 10 years, her goal had come within her reach. After all, hadn't a hero finally appeared in this era? The presence of the hero added even more value to the price that Christina had paid her life for. It wasn't long now. Christina opened her eyes and looked down. The dagger that had been placed in front of her knees caught her eye. The blade had been sharpened to the point where it couldn't be any sharper. She had already spent enough time in hesitation. Now she had prepared herself and made up her mind. Christina immediately reached out and grasped the hilt of the dagger and lifted the ghastly blade. Just like how this room was familiar yet discomforting, the hilt of the dagger that her fingers were wrapped firmly around also felt familiar yet uncomfortable. Christina's face was reflected within the polished blade. A face so stiff and lifeless that even she couldn't recognize herself in it. Without any trace of joy, the corners of her mouth drew a straight line across her face, and her eyes were dull and sunken. Such a face was the true essence of the person called Christina. Most of the time, Christina didn't feel much of an urge to smile. Did you notice that? Christina silently asked Eugene. He probably had. Christina tilted the dagger slightly so that her own face was no longer visible within it. She had sensed that he had seen through her during the months they had wandered through Samar together, and she had also felt it during the short time they had ridden the train together. Is something wrong? You had a strange look on your face. It feels like you're forcing yourself to laugh. Compared to a few months ago, you've regressed back to the way that a saint is supposed to speak to the hero. Christina saw Eugene's face in the slanted blade of her dagger. A face that was full of ill-tempered mischief. A goading smile that could hardly be imagined to come from a hero. I don't care if I give off that feeling. Eugene's voice rang out inside her head. The corners of Christina's mouth twitched in a smile. Rather than a bond between the hero and the saint, I would prefer a bond between one person and another. Because such a bond is much deeper and more sincere. No, it isn't, Christina muttered as she looked down at the dagger. There was no way that a bond between one person and another could be deeper and stronger than the bond between the saint and the hero. Christina sincerely believed this. She couldn't help but do so. Christina Rogers didn't know anything about the bond that could exist between two different people. All the bonds she had forged were based on her identity as the saint candidate. Kristen was well aware of the fact that everyone around her was an actor in a play that starred her as the saint candidate. In her view, the ties that existed between one person and another were so light and thin as to be insignificant. That was what she believed. That was what she had to believe. Christina no longer saw Eugene's face in the dagger. The only thing that she could see was herself wearing a pure white shroud. Without any hesitation, Christina brought the dagger to her wrist. In order for her to be reborn as the saint. in order to build the bond between the hero and the saint. The future she had longed for and envisioned for the past 10 years would soon be ushered in. With emotionless eyes, Christina slit her own wrist. Even though Eugene had slept while hugging the sword all night long, he didn't receive any dreams. In the end, he just ended up greeting the following day. Fuck. Eugene spat out a curse as he got out of bed. The natural lighting in this damn room was a bit too good for him to fully appreciate. The sunlight pouring in from the window was so bright that it stung his eyes to the point of pain. That alone would have been irritating enough, but there weren't even any curtains installed on the windows to block out the sunlight. It seems that you didn't have a nice dream, Mare said with a giggle as she sat next to the bed and read the scripture book. Eugene squinted his eyes at the scripture book, its densely layered pages rendering it quite thick in Mare's hands. Is it interesting? Eugene asked. It's more interesting than I thought it would be, Mare admitted. As long as I just consider it to be a novel, that is. Is it more interesting than the fairy tale that Sienna wrote? Please don't try to fool me so sneakily. No matter what you say, I don't believe that Lady Sienna is the one who wrote that fairy tale. Eugene clicked his tongue at Mare's exasperated denial. He then shot a glare at the holy sword that he had placed beside him. Even though it had invaded his dreams of its own volition and showed him a vision of the past, this time when he had gone so far as to do something crazy like hugging it in his sleep to get it to show him something, it had failed. Even though Eugene had practically set the stage for it to show him whatever it wanted, the holy sword had refused to show anything this time. Should I just break it? Eugene muttered to himself. If you do that, the zealots of Euros will be sure to try and capture you for execution, Mare warned Eugene with a forceful stare and a solemn expression as she got down from her chair. Then she brought her hands together in front of her chest and took up a praying posture as she said, "Divine punishment is what they'll shout while trying to grab you. I know that you are strong, but wouldn't it still be scary if hundreds or even thousands of fanatics who are prepared to martyr themselves were to attack you?" "I don't know if that's scary, but it sure sounds annoying," Eugene said as he glanced towards the door. He could feel a presence coming from beyond the closed door. "They've been waiting there for about 2 hours now," Mare informed him. "What a uselessly sincere person," Eugene commented sarcastically. Mare shrugged. "It's probably just to keep an eye on you, Sir Eugene." Rinsol was the one waiting outside the door. As soon as Eugene opened the door, Rinsol smiled broadly and approached with a greeting. "Sir Eugene, did you have a good night? How would you like to have your breakfast? We can have it delivered to your room if you wish, but if possible, how about having breakfast together in the dining hall?" Eugene hummed. What's the difference between having breakfast delivered or eating in the dining hall? Is there a difference in the contents of the menu? Not at all. Rinsol immediately denied. It's just that I was hoping that the other clergy who serve in the cathedral would be able to offer their welcomes to Sir Eugene. To me? Weren't the things regarding my identity meant to be kept a secret from the ordinary clergy members? Eugene asked in confusion. You don't need to worry about that. All that the other clergy of this cathedral know is that Sir Eugene from the Lionheart clan is currently visiting as the friend of the saint candidate Christina, Rinsol revealed as he lowered his voice to a whisper. It's just that the name of Eugene Lionheart is so famous. The younger priest seemed to want to meet with you, Sir Eugene, and have a talk with you about the gracious light. Although he'd expected this, Eugene feigned a puzzled expression. These priests weren't really trying to meet with Eugene to evangelize him. The truth was that the church's finances and the clergy's pockets were all filled by generous donations from believers and noble patrons. Since the Lionheart clan was a prestigious clan famous across the continent, the priests must be hoping to secure ample donations by establishing a strong connection with Eugene. I'll have my breakfast served in my room, Eugene decided. Since I don't have any reason to go out on my own, just bring my meals here whenever it's mealtime. That's quite a pity, Rinsol sighed. The chapel at noon when the sun is at its highest is extremely beautiful. But wouldn't that beautiful chapel be crowded with clergy and believers? Eugene grumbled as he looked out of a window. Believers who had come to worship in the cathedral were already lining up outside. Eugene didn't have the slightest desire to mingle with the other priests or believers. As such, Eugene just shut himself up in his room. He filled himself with the meals Rinsol brought him each time for breakfast, lunch and dinner. Ever since Eugene had woken up, he had held on to the holy sword, focused his thoughts on it and tried to get it to respond. However, nothing happened. Like before, while it was possible to get the holy sword to emit light whenever he used it, the back of the girl he had seen the previous day never reappeared. Time after time, Eugene called upon the holy sword's light, but nothing special happened. So in the end he just went to sleep. Still hugging the holy sword, Eugene went into a deep sleep that lasted until the following morning. Perhaps because he so desperately wanted to see a dream, he really did end up dreaming. Inside his dream, Eugene ran around on fluffy clouds. He couldn't figure out why he was running. However, he knew that the cloud he was running on wasn't actually a real cloud, but one made up of sweet cotton candy. After running around on the cotton candy like this, at some point the cotton candy became a lake of chocolate. In the middle of the lake, Mare was pedaling a boat in the shape of a duck. With her arms packed full of marshmallows, Mare pedaled across the lake. Then she bit off a wet marshmallow and rescued Eugene, who was drowning in the chocolate lake. Sir Eugene has turned into chocolate. What kind of dream was that? Eugene grumbled upon waking. What a shitty dream. Eugene scratched his head, then picked up the holy sword and threw it away. The sharp blade pierced through the floor, but that didn't bother Eugene. Sir Eugene, you really have a nasty personality, said Mare, gnawing on a piece of chocolate next to the bed. Eugene spotted the skewers from a piece of cotton candy and a marshmallow wrapper next to Mare. Are you treating my cloak like your storeroom? Eugene demanded. Rather than a storeroom, it's more like my house. So it's up to me to store whatever I want inside my house, Mare declared proudly. Strictly speaking, you're not really the owner of the house. I'm the landlord while you're just a tenant. Though you don't even pay any rent, Eugene complained. Mare argued back, of course I pay rent. Aren't I a great help to you, Sir Eugene? Just imagine, Sir Eugene, what would it be like if I wasn't at your side? You would surely have been very lonely and bored. Even now, Sir Eugene, I'm at your side and talking with you, aren't I? Eugene hummed, unable to deny Mare's words. Mare changed the subject. In any case, Sir Eugene, did you still fail to have a dream? I did dream about something. What kind of dream was it? A shitty dream, Eugene grumbled as he pulled out the holy sword embedded into the floor. Eugene spent the next 2 days inside the room. His isolation wasn't completely pointless. Thanks to spending so much time holding to the holy sword, he was able to come up with several hypotheses. The revelation he was looking for hadn't appeared in the summoned light, nor had it interfered with his dreams. Since that was the case, he couldn't help but think that the chapel might be the vital location. Those pillars of light and the holy sword. What if the holy sword had managed to touch on something while it was there? After having spent 2 days verifying his suspicions, Eugene now had no choice but to take a closer look at the cathedral. Thankfully, Cardinal Rogerus had gone away, so there were no inquisitors there to keep watch. This is the second day, Eugene realized as he thought of Christina. Since he had been told that the ritual held at the Fount of Light would take 3 days, the ritual should be over by tomorrow. Eugene still didn't know what kind of ritual was taking place at the Fount of Light. Was the ritual that Christina was taking part in something that needed to be done even if she didn't want to? Eugene couldn't help but suspect that. If Christina had just told him, I don't want to go, Eugene would have ensured that Christina didn't go to the spring. However, Christina hadn't said that. The ritual at the spring seemed important, and for Christina herself, her title of the saint held a lot of meaning. In the end, Christina had still decided to head to the Fount of Light. While desperately hiding her expression that openly said she didn't want to go, she resolutely chose to show her resolve. Then she had left Eugene behind. As for Eugene, he wanted to respect her decision. Christina hadn't asked for Eugene's sympathy. All she wanted was to become the official saint and build a formal bond with the hero. The saint and the hero. Eugene definitely couldn't empathize or sympathize with her desire for such a relationship, but he knew that was what Christina had desperately wished for. Or at least that's what he thought. That night, the believers who had filled the cathedral from dawn until sunset had all gone home, and the clergy had returned to their quarters. As midnight approached, the vast cathedral fell silent as not a single person remained within. It was rare to find any shadowy places in this cathedral, but that didn't matter to Eugene. He was able to use stealth magic and could even suppress his presence. Using these, Eugene snuck out of his room and entered the cathedral. Eugene raised his head to look up at the pillars of light. The light was still pouring in from the glass on the walls and the ceiling. He hadn't taken the holy sword out yet, leaving it inside his cloak. It would be annoying if he were to take it out, only for it to needlessly run while emitting light all on its own like it had the day before yesterday. "Aren't your eyes dazzled by that?" Mare asked, surprised at the sight of Eugene looking straight at the pillars of light. She definitely wouldn't be able to look straight into the light like he currently was. It was so bright that Mare wouldn't even be able to see it properly, and it felt like her vision would be covered in red and white splotches. "I can't see too clearly," Eugene silently admitted. Eugene's eyes could peer through even the deepest darkness, and no matter how bright the day was he could even look straight at the sun. But even he couldn't see through this light. The closer he tried to get a look at the center, the more his eyes began to tingle and his vision began to shake. But if he couldn't see it clearly from a distance, he would just need to get close. Eugene leaped up into the sky into the pillars of light. He had been trying to ascend to the ceiling all at once, but his body couldn't float up as lightly as he had expected. As if the light itself had weight, it was pressing down on Eugene's body. "So what?" Eugene snorted and drew on his mana. Using it, he was able to slowly climb up into the light. Although the ceiling had seemed quite high, it wasn't this high, was it? In the middle of his rise, Eugene realized something was off and looked down at the ground. But he couldn't see the floor. All he could see was light. Everything below seemed infinitely low and everything above seemed infinitely high. And the light that had been weighing down on Eugene, at some point, had begun to pull Eugene upwards. Eugene had a sudden thought. Was this what a divine ascension felt like? In the scripture book that Sergio had given him, there were many stories of saints who had ascended to heaven and gone to sit at the side of the God of light. Perhaps Anise had ascended to heaven like this and became an angel. Eugene spotted something. That's the source of the light, which had seemed infinitely far away, had already started approaching him before he knew it. It was so bright that it was hard to see, but by squinting his eyes, Eugene could see what lay on the other side of the light. What he saw there was a large rice bowl. 300 years ago, while the party was traveling together, most nights were spent resting and making their own food. The order of who made the meals always changed, but they each had their own tableware set aside from the others. Mullen's rice bowl was the largest, followed by Vermouth's. Unexpectedly, Vermouth was quite the big eater. Then Hamel came third. As for Anise, she didn't actually use her rice bowl for food. She used that large bowl to hold her holy water. Whenever the time came to open up the lid of the large keg they kept stocked, Anise was the first to run over and grab a drink using her bowl. Anise called the bowl her Holy Grail. At the other end of the light laid that same rice bowl, no, the Holy Grail. Eugene looked at the Holy Grail, which was tilted crookedly to the side with blank eyes. There were cracks here and there and a few chips were missing, but it was unmistakable. That was Anise's Holy Grail. The light was pouring down from her Holy Grail. That's just why. No, before that, Eugene shook himself and approached the Holy Grail. It was clear to see that if he just pulled it out like this, something irreversible would happen. So instead of reaching for the Holy Grail, Eugene retrieved Akasha from inside his cloak. Then he immediately used the draconic spell to try and find Anise. A faint light was emitted from Akasha's dragon heart. As the draconic spell unfolded, it forged a connection with Anise's Holy Grail. A little more. A little deeper. Just a little bit closer. Eugene's vision was suddenly consumed with light. He saw a young girl standing there absent-mindedly wearing a white dress. Unlike when he saw her last time, she wasn't standing with her back facing him. Her age seemed a little over 10 years old at most. She had long blonde hair and blue eyes. Then came the smell of blood. Ever so slowly the smell grew stronger. The stronger the smell got, the more blood began to spread across the girl's clothes. Blood flowed down from both her wrists to drip on the floor. It wasn't just her wrists. Her ankles, calves, thighs, stomach, sides, and chest. Bloody lines were drawn all over her body with blood dripping down from them. However, the girl's face was determined. As if she didn't even know what pain was, the girl stood there resolutely, covered in blood, without a single twitch in her expression. The girl's spilled blood collected on the floor. Then the pooled blood began to flow away like a river. Now there was another girl. The new girl was very similar to the girl standing next to her, but there were a few differences. She had a mole under her eye, and then there was her facial expression. Lines of blood were drawn one by one on the new girl's body, but she couldn't endure it and stand tall like the girl next to her. She bit her lip as she endured the pain, her eyes furrowed, and in the end she wasn't able to take it and burst into tears. The girl's tears flowed down alongside her blood. The first girl standing next to her didn't look at the crying girl. But her blood that had pooled on the floor flowed over and collected at the feet of the crying girl. The blood pouring down from the crying girl mixed with the pool of the first girl's blood. And then the blood flowed up in reverse and seeped into the crying girl's wounds. Eugene watched this happen with a blank look. Naturally, he had recognized the two girls. Anise was the girl with the determined expression, and Christina was the one crying next to her. What was going on? The moment Eugene thought of this question and reached out with his hand, the distance between Anise and Christina grew far apart. And then many other girls were suddenly standing in between them. The newly arrived girls didn't resemble Anise the way that Christina did. However, standing in the middle of the river of blood that started from Anise, they all shed their blood together, and the long river of blood that was created through this method continued all the way to Christina. "Look closely, Hamel," the girl Anise spoke up. Anise was still in her younger form. She didn't have any wings spreading out from her like when she had appeared in the form of an angel. Instead, she raised her bloody hand and reached out to Eugene. Anise continued speaking, "At this abominable bond." Anise. The moment that Eugene was about to call out her name, Prayesh, the light exploded. The glass walls and ceilings of the cathedral from which the pillars of light had poured down were now shattered. Countless shards of glass fell down like rain. In the middle of all this, Eugene reached out his hand to catch the falling Holy Grail. The moment he caught the Holy Grail, a vivid memory was engraved within Eugene's mind. It was the traces that Anise had left behind in this holy relic. Eugene remained silent, confusion at what had just happened running through his head. "Sir Eugene. Oh my God, what on earth?" The pillars of light, which had been displaying their majesty within the Trescia Cathedral for hundreds of years, had all been destroyed. Shards of glass mixed in with the light as they all poured down. In the midst of this scene, Eugene was staring down at the Holy Grail and Akasha in his hands. He knew what he had just seen. However, he just couldn't understand what it meant. The Holy Grail was an item with a soul. Among all the holy relics, physical remains were more valuable than any other relics, as they hadn't just been close to a saint, they had been part of a saint. Perhaps that's why he was able to get a closer look than when he had tried the spell on the necklace. The result might be blurred, but it was still recognizable. Within the Trescia Cathedral, the altar that lay beneath the pillars of light. Through Akasha's draconic spell, Anise's Holy Grail was pointing to the holy relic stored beneath the altar. He had been told it was the jawbone of a saintess from 400 years ago. So why were Anise's holy relic and Akasha's draconic spell pointing to that jawbone? Eugene couldn't think of any guesses. But he didn't even want to guess. Chapter 188. The Cathedral 4. The falling shards of glass crashed into the floor and were further shattered. In the middle of the roaring sound created by this, Eugene was standing absent-mindedly. Shards piled up on or bounced off his head and shoulders, and the sound was deafeningly loud, but in Eugene's ears, there was absolute silence. Even though tens of thousands of these glass shards were pouring down on him, they couldn't pierce his skin or cause him to bleed, but his whole body throbbed in pain as if it was being torn to pieces with a sharp knife. Or at least that's how it felt. Eugene stared down at Anise's Holy Grail that he was holding in his left hand. The afterimage of what he had seen was still lingering in his head. He saw the girls standing there with blood flowing down from them. The expressionless Anise, the crying Christina, and the countless girls who had existed in between them. Eugene hadn't been able to make out those girls' expressions clearly. He felt nauseous. The bloody smell he shouldn't still be sensing lingered beneath his nose and refused to leave. "Sir Eugene," a voice called out as Rinsol and several other clerics hesitantly approached Eugene. They were having a hard time understanding the situation. The destruction of the pillars of light, which had been the pride of this cathedral for hundreds of years, had befuddled their minds, and the presence of Eugene Lionheart in the center of this left them in even more confusion. From how things looked, it appeared as though Eugene was the one to destroy the pillars of light. But why in the world would he do that? What reason could there be for him to do so? Even the priests who weren't aware of Eugene's identity thought this way. And Rinsol, who knew that Eugene was the hero, was even more certain that Eugene had no reason to do this. Are you all right? Rensol asked tentatively. For now, please come over here. We don't know if the walls won't continue to collapse. Staying there is far too dangerous. A voice was babbling nonsense at him, but Eugene could only hear the sound of his heart beating ever faster, like it was about to explode. His empty right hand was clenched tight enough that it seemed like he was trying to crush his bones. His breaths raced alongside the thumping of his heart. Eugene panted for breath as he lifted his head. He saw the altar of the cathedral. Thanks to the shards of glass that had fallen from above, the altar and its surroundings were covered in glass fragments. As Eugene stepped towards the altar, shards of glass cracked beneath his feet. When Eugene began to approach the altar, the bewilderment on the faces of Rensol and the other priests only mounted. They couldn't tell what Eugene's intentions were, but they could somewhat read the kind of atmosphere that he was giving off. Sir Eugene, Mare tentatively spoke up from inside his cloak. But Eugene didn't have the spare focus to answer her. As Eugene absent-mindedly did what he could to suppress his overflowing killing intent, he kicked over the altar with one foot. Bang! The altar didn't topple over, nor was it sent flying. The moment Eugene kicked it, the altar shattered into a cloud of dust. Having removed the altar, Eugene picked up the saintess jawbone that had been placed into the hollow floor beneath. Sir Eugene, Rensol stammered as he called out Eugene's name. That was the jawbone of the saintess from 400 years ago. Among all the holy relics enshrined within the Trescia Cathedral, it was a rare first-class holy relic that could only be compared to the skull of Saint Theodore. Please put it back down, Rensol pleaded. I really don't know why you are doing all this, but you can't just touch that without permission. Eugene wasn't listening to him. He just threw the jawbone into Anis's holy grail and turned around. The priests couldn't follow Eugene as he left the main cathedral. Sir Eugene, are you all right? You're okay, right? Mare repeated herself in concern. I'm fine, Eugene responded as he exited the cathedral. This was a lie. In Eugene's opinion, his current self wasn't all right at all. But it also wasn't all that rare for his emotions to get riled up to this extent. When he had discovered the death knight made from Hamel's corpse in the desert grave. When Barong attacked Signard and the other elves in the Samar rainforest. When Uat had captured his relatives to use as a sacrifice at the Black Lion Castle. And when he had to face the remnants of the Demon Kings. However, the emotions that had rioted during those events had at least been clear and certain. He had felt anger, rage, and other such feelings. However, Eugene was currently uncertain about what he was feeling. These feelings were just as intense as they were back then, but he still wasn't sure whether this emotion rising within him was anger, rage, or something else. Yo! The truth was, I do know. Eugene actually did know what he was feeling and what he was thinking. He just didn't want to admit it. Eugene bit down firmly on his lower lips as he reached inside his cloak to pull out a key. Mare grabbed Eugene's hand. She stuck her face out of the cloak and looked up at Eugene with a concerned expression. Her green eyes, which so resembled Sienna's, were trembling with anxiety. Although Eugene hadn't been certain what kind of expression he had on his face, now he knew. The face reflected back at him from within Mare's eyes looked unfamiliar even to himself. I'm fine, Eugene repeated once more. Even though he knew he wasn't fine, Eugene couldn't help but say he was. Mare also could sense what he was feeling. Mare knew she couldn't hold Eugene in place or calm him down, and she also knew that she didn't have the justification for doing so. So in the end, Mare didn't say anything and just let go of Eugene's hand. While accepting Mare's worried gaze, Eugene lifted Akasha. This saintess jawbone was from 400 years ago. Anis had been born 300 years ago. Eugene didn't understand what exactly this gap of 100 years meant. He didn't even want to understand. However, in the end the outcome was still the same. Even if he didn't want to, he needed to understand. Even though Eugene didn't want to admit the truth, he knew he had no choice but to accept it. He could still hear the sound of his own heartbeat pounding loudly in his ears. Swallowing a heavy breath, Eugene cast Akasha's draconic spell. Crack crack. Something flowed into Eugene's head. The connection between him and this relic from hundreds of years ago was projected into Eugene's mind. The resulting picture wasn't clear. Perhaps because it was from so long ago. Or perhaps because the relic was so damaged? He didn't know which it was, but Eugene saw a scene undercut with crackling static play out inside his head. Once again, Eugene saw the abominable bond that lay between those girls whose feet were soaked in the flowing river of blood. There was Anise, Christina, and all the other girls apart from them. But this time, Anise wasn't the one at the head of the line. Even before Anise, there was another girl, no girls who were letting their blood flow freely. Their faces were missing. Of all the girls standing there, the only two whose faces were clearly visible were Anise and Christina. The other girls' faces were gone. It wasn't that he couldn't see them clearly. They literally didn't have faces. Their features weren't obscured by a haze of fog either. Whether it was their eyes, noses, or lips, they didn't have any of those features. It was a grotesque and creepy sight to see all these girls with empty faces standing in line, letting out their blood. Eugene's eyes went to one of the girls standing in front of Anise. Like the others, the girl didn't have a face, but she wasn't just missing her eyes, nose, and mouth. She didn't have a chin either. So her face looked like the lower half had been cut off. It looked like it would be painful to even breathe. Eugene knew this girl had to be the saintess from 400 years ago. If that was the case, what about all the other girls standing in front of her? And what about the girls standing between Anise and Christina? Eugene had already figured out who they were earlier. But just like these feelings within him, the answer wasn't something he had wanted to accept. He needed to see more. Bowing his head, Eugene walked forward. The Holy Grail and the jawbone were swallowed up together by the light. There must be more that you want to show me. I'm fine. I don't have any problems with continuing. I'm prepared to see everything. As Eugene muttered these reassurances to himself, Anise, still with an expressionless face, closed her eyes. One by one, all the girls collapsed and disappeared. All the saints standing there collapsed like sand castles, becoming part of the river that flowed with spilled blood. The red flow of blood became a spiraling whirlpool within the center of Eugene's field of vision. Crack, crack. The noise created a distortion in the image. Finally, the terrifyingly red whirlpool settled down to become a calm body of water. A beautiful and brightly shining spring. Boom. The sound rang out from below Eugene's feet. It was the sound of footprints being crushed into the floor and left behind as Eugene's footsteps landed too heavily for the floor to withstand. While trying to calm the emotions raging within him, Eugene tried to think about the situation, know about everything that he had just found out. The fount of light. He didn't know where exactly it was. Seeing as it wasn't made public knowledge, it had to be a place that was kept secret even within Tresha. From what he had seen in the projection, it didn't seem to be inside a building. There were ancient pillars. Eugene thought he had seen the remains of a temple that looked so old it could be called a ruin. Where was it? There was no place like that near the cathedral. As for Christina was currently at that site. Eugene continued walking. He didn't know what exactly that spring was. He also didn't know the purpose of the ritual being held there. Christina had said that ritual was necessary and that she herself was taking part in it willingly. No matter how suspicious the ritual had seemed, Eugene had been willing to respect Christina's choice. Look closely, Hamel. At this abominable bond. Anise, in the form of a young girl, had raised her hands, which were covered in blood. Christina, who was also in the form of a young girl, had been crying next to Anise. Ever since they had reunited in Eurasia, her attitude had been strange. Respect her. Eugene rubbed his own stiff cheeks. Since when have I ever been so considerate of others? When that thought popped into his head, Eugene didn't hesitate any longer. Bong. The ground beneath Eugene's feet shattered and collapsed as he launched himself into the air. Eugene turned his back on the purple night sky above the city, which was far too bright. The wind that he had summoned held Eugene's body aloft. After flying high enough that he was able to view all of the huge Tresha Cathedral in one go, Eugene lifted up. The dragon heart emitted light. With his eyes wide open, Eugene saw the myriad spells that had been layered over the cathedral. Most of the spells dealt with maintaining the building and enhancing its aesthetics. These weren't the spells that he was using Akasha to look for. One by one, Eugene removed these countless spells from his search. Although he had Mare's assistance, so much magic information was being forced into his field of vision that Eugene's head was pounding. Still, it felt better for him to have a headache because of this. Instead of distracting Eugene's thoughts, the throbbing headache was actually sharpening his mind. Going deeper, ever deeper, his eyes grew bloodshot as he forced out even more concentration through gritted teeth. His eyes, which were dyed with a red light, penetrated deep into the basement of the cathedral. He had found it. The corners of Eugene's mouth twisted upwards. He recalled what Mare had said on the first day they had arrived in Eurus. He didn't know if it was used for convenience, but there really was a hidden warp gate buried deep beneath the cathedral. Eugene then found the path that led to this basement. So there was no longer any need to stay aloft like this. Eugene immediately flew downward, heading to the clock tower and the door that led underground that was hidden within it. "Sir Eugene," a voice interrupted him. It was Rinsol. He was blocking the entrance to the clock tower along with a few other priests. Please return to your room," Rinsol stammered. "Why in the world are you doing this? Why would you take those holy relics?" "Get out of the way," Eugene spat in an unfamiliar voice. Without stopping, Eugene just kept walking towards them briskly. "Sir Eugene, were you also responsible for shattering the pillars of light? Just why would you do that? Please give us an explanation," Rinsol bravely demanded. It seemed that they didn't have any intention of backing down from just a warning. Eugene immediately summoned a gust of wind. He had no intention of harming Rinsol, who was just trying to block Eugene's way forward. It was just Eugene only wanted to move them aside so they wouldn't bother him any longer. They wanted an explanation? How was he supposed to explain the emotions he was feeling right now and the things that had been projected into his head? In the first place, Eugene was the one who wanted an explanation. So Eugene just kept his mouth shut and swung the wind towards them. Whoosh! Frightened by the attack, Rinsol and the priests called upon the light and raised a barrier of divine power to block Eugene's way forward. Just looking at this bright light made Eugene feel like the bloody smell from earlier was wafting around him once more. Boom! The wind sent the priests flying to the side. Then instead of dispersing, the wind pulled together and smashed open the door of the clock tower. Now that the way ahead had been opened up like this, Eugene's feet floated into the air once more. Eugene immediately flew into the clock tower without any further delay. Then, searching for the underground door he had discovered earlier, he brandished the wind again. Boom! All of the statues that were standing along the walls were completely shattered. The secret door leading underground could only be opened by elaborately manipulating these statues, but Eugene didn't want to waste time on that, so he just smashed the door open. Passing through the stairs that led deep into the basement, he arrived at the cellar that held the warp gate. The magic light of the portal wasn't lit. This meant that the door wasn't connected anywhere. A warp gate always needed a wizard manning it in order to maintain the connection to the coordinates of the linked doors. However, apart from Eugene, there wasn't anyone else there at the moment. It was clear what had happened without even needing to think about it. After Cardinal Rogerus had left with the Inquisitors, he had completely shut down the door of the warp gate. "Ha!" Eugene let out a dry laugh as he headed to the warp gate. Mare, who read his intentions, panicked and pulled herself out of his cloak to grab Eugene by his shoulders. "That plan is way too reckless and dangerous." Mare shrieked. "Mare, let go," Eugene ordered. "Sir Eugene, please calm down," Mare begged. A warp gate is the highest level of spatial magic. Even though a wizard of the fifth circle can maintain the connection between gates, you need to be at least a sixth circle wizard to create a new connection. Do you really think I don't know that? Of course you know. That's why I'm telling you not to do this. The fact that you're trying to do something like this even though you know all that just means that, Sir Eugene, you aren't in your right mind right now. Mare was right. The warp gate that maintained a connection over long distances was the highest level of spatial magic. Eugene's current level as a wizard was at the fifth circle. With the help of Akasha and Mare, he could use spells up to the seventh circle, but it was still too risky for Eugene to try and forcefully open the door. The warp gates recorded a unique wavelength for each connected door. The wavelengths on both sides of the door needed to resonate with each other to open the door and maintain a connection. Naturally, only the wizard who managed the warp gate knew the spell to create these wavelengths. It wasn't possible for Eugene to open the door unless he knew the spatial coordinates of the fount of light and the wavelengths required for the resonance. Mare desperately tried to persuade him. If you used a calculation device and added Akasha on top of that, you might be able to forcefully match the wavelengths. However, Sir Eugene, you should also be aware that such a connection can't help but be unstable, right? Spatial magic, especially magic that involves crossing long distances like a warp, is far too risky when it fails. If the connection goes wrong. Eugene cut her off. "I won't fail." "Huh?" Mare voiced her confusion. "It'll be fine if I can just roughly forge a connection," Eugene assured her. After that, I can tune the wavelength while I'm in the middle of the crossing. That way we won't get out of sync and the connection should have no problems. But that's just absurd, Mare protested. To adjust the coordinates and tune the wavelengths in real time without first knowing the coordinates of the exit. Even for me, such calculations are impossible. That's not even in the realm of pure calculation anymore. I have no intention of making you do it for me, so don't worry, Eugene said as he shrugged off Mare's hand from his shoulder. Then he firmly pushed down on Mare's head and shoved her back inside his cloak. Kaya! Mare yelped in complaint. Stay in there patiently and don't come out, Eugene ordered. Then he tightly closed the cloak's opening so that she wouldn't be able to escape. Eugene waved Akasha and pointed it at the warp gate. Eugene was at the brink of the sixth circle. It had been difficult to understand how far he had yet to go when he first got his hands on Akasha, but after going through the civil strife at the Black Lion Castle and his continued training beneath the lake at the main estate, his magic level had also risen. Perhaps because of this, Eugene was able to read the formula of the warp gate immediately. The mana drawn from his white flame formula flowed into the warp gate. Fwoosh! The space between the two pillars of the warp gate distorted and began to shine. The spatial connection was ready to be opened, but the wavelength of the door had yet to resonate with the other side. If all that Eugene had available was the ability to read the formula, then he wouldn't have had any other way from here. However, Akasha didn't just grant the ability to read spells. It also granted the ability to understand them. Eugene's eyes throbbed. He licked his lips as he prepared himself for the use of high-speed frequency changing. Mare didn't want to help him. However, she couldn't really refuse to do anything. Inside the cloak, Mare let out a deep sigh and began syncing her consciousness with Eugene's. Then she realized just what an absurd thing Eugene was about to do. Akasha allowed him to comprehend the formulas of the warp gate. In addition, he would use the search magic of the draconic spell to scan the connection with the other side of the door. The spell itself would make a reverse calculation from the minute traces of the other side of the connection that had been left on the closed warp gate, to predict the spatial coordinates on the other side. Eugene then intended to infuse his mana into the warp gate for each of the innumerable coordinates that were derived through this method to generate a momentary wavelength and then repeat this until he could match the wavelengths for each coordinate. This was crazy. It was brutal, mindless labor behind a mask of advanced magic. This wasn't a task that a single wizard could ever manage. Even an archwizard couldn't connect all these different warp gates over and over again while performing such a huge amount of calculations each time. There was no way that such a plan was possible. If anyone were to try to do this, their mana would be depleted immediately. However, Eugene made it possible. Akasha reduced the amount of mana that was needed for the magic. Mare was able to share the work of calculating the coordinates. Operating the ring flame formula would allow Eugene to recover all the mana wasted. His senses, which were sharpened to their limit, would be able to detect the changes in the wavelengths. It didn't matter if the wavelengths weren't perfectly resonant. As long as there was one moment when they did resonate, Eugene wouldn't miss that chance. When tears of blood began to flow down from his wide-open eyes and collect on the tip of his chin, Eugene pushed Akasha forward. A ripple formed in the distorted space. Without sparing any mana, Eugene poured out everything he had. The ripples were getting bigger and bigger. Eugene's mana was forced into the patch connecting the two sides and hammered on the closed door. Fwoosh! The distorted space was suddenly filled with light. The warp gates were successfully connected. Inside the cloak, Mare sprawled out in exhaustion. At this point, she felt like she would be happy to use the pause function that she had hated so much. No, I can't, Mare thought to herself as she shook her head. Eugene slowly walked up to the warp gate. This door was connected to the fount of light. He didn't really want to imagine what he might see there. But he'd be seeing it soon in any case. Eugene closed his strained eyes and passed through the warp gate. The fount of light was a sanctuary where the grace of God had resided ever since ancient times. Even amongst Yura's numerous priests, only a few priests whose faith had been verified beyond doubt were aware of the existence of the fount of light. And among these priests only a few authority figures were allowed to see the fount of light in person, but even so, all the paladins and inquisitors who had been mobilized for this mission felt a great honor and sense of excitement just from being given the duty to protect the spring and the saint candidates staying there. This wasn't even a difficult test. They were at a temple deep within the mountains. Various miracles and spells were protecting this place from being seen with the naked eye. It was impossible for wild beasts or anyone else to enter this site even by chance. Just in case, they had been on guard for several days. But in the 2 days since the ritual had begun, not even a single rabbit, let alone a person, had come close to the temple. But they still didn't let their guard down in the slightest. It would be impossible for any of the paladins or inquisitors who had been mobilized to protect this holy sacrament from lowering their guards on the grounds that the mission wasn't strenuous. If any of them had been that bendable, they wouldn't have been called to this ceremony. The Knights of the Blood Cross were called the Shield of Light. The Maleficarum of the Inquisition was called the Hammer of Light. The paladins and inquisitors who had been recruited from their respective organizations all felt it at the same time. The warp gate that was supposed to have been closed was now open. Someone had just passed through the warp gate and had arrived near the temple. Though they had never expected such a thing to happen, since it had what they needed to do next was clear. Honored Cardinal. I'm aware. The call was silently conveyed from inside their heads. Sergio replied to the alert without any signs of amusement on his face. However, he didn't get up from where he was kneeling. Currently, Sergio couldn't make a move personally. It wasn't just Sergio either. There were 2 people kneeling together with him, offering up their prayers. There was Giovanni, one of the captains of the Knights of the Blood Cross, and Inquisitor Atterix. Originally, this ritual was meant to be conducted by Sergio alone, but the ritual taking place this time was special. So along with the other paladins and inquisitors who had been mobilized, these 2 individuals with strong divine power were assisting Sergio. Sir Eugene appears to have arrived by Warp Gate, Sergio informed the others. Should we capture him? Atterix asked, glancing at Sergio's expression. With all due respect, Sergio agreed to the proposal without immediately revealing his surging emotions. If possible, try to get him to return on his own accord. If that is impossible, then it can't be helped. You all should be well aware of just how important this ritual is. Even if it causes Sir Eugene some offense, we have to send him back immediately. Yes, sir. We will follow your orders. But how had Eugene shown up here? He had definitely closed the warp gate. Sergio had heard that Eugene Lionheart's talent as a wizard was also exceptional, but shouldn't it have been impossible for even an archwizard to have connected both sides of a warp gate by themselves? How surprising, Sergio commented with a dull expression as he settled his own emotions. It was certainly impossible, unbelievable, and surprising. But that was only when taken within the scope of what humans were capable of. Eugene's achievement was nothing compared to the miracles caused by God. Sergio once more put his hands together to pray and looked straight ahead. In front of him, a gentle light was shining. The light came from the water rising from a spring deep underground that shone even in the dark. The water had a slight warmth to it, though there wasn't any particular scent. The water didn't just shine. It also had a much stronger sacred power than even the holy water blessed by a high-ranking priest like himself. In the middle of this spring, Christina, dressed in pure white robes resembling a shroud, was immersed in its light. Blood was flowing from the countless wounds that covered her body. Christina's blood mixed with the spring water, but the water of the spring didn't turn red. Sergio, who had been watching this, slowly stood up. He pulled out a dagger that had been immersed in the spring and approached Christina. The pure waters of the spring were full of divine power. No matter how many times she was cut, Christina's wounds were healed by the divine grace infused into the light of the spring. This sight was truly miraculous. Sergio looked down at Christina, whose eyes were closed as she recited her prayers. Saint Candidate, Sergio called out to her with his voice, but Christina didn't respond. She wasn't asleep. Christina's consciousness was still awake, but her body couldn't move according to her will. Because her eyes were closed, she wasn't able to see anything. Some of her senses had been suppressed, but other senses were dozens of times more sensitive than usual. You need to be patient, Sergio advised her. During the previous ritual, Christina had sat in this spring and cut herself with a knife over the course of several days. Even as the light healed one wound after another, until the end of the ritual, Christina was forced to cut herself and spill her blood over and over again. Christina's sensitivity towards pain, which had been sharpened by dozens of times more than usual, had inflicted enough pain on her that it would have been a relief to just go crazy or die. But this spring was able to keep a supplicant's mind from going insane. Instead, it actually awakened Christina's consciousness to such an extent that she could keep carving open these wounds on her body. For the ritual held this time, it was only on the first day that Christina had to cut her own body. From the second day onwards, it was Sergio who instead carved these stigmata onto Christina. Thus there was no way for her to adapt to the pain. The pain was also sharper than before. Christina never knew exactly where Sergio would start to carve, but she couldn't allow herself to be afraid of him. The light was warm and comforting. She repeated this thought to herself as she continued to recite her prayers inside of her mind. O omniscient and omnipotent God of light, please watch over my soul. Illuminate my soul with your light and cleanse my blood. Please burn away my passions with your light and leave your light in its place. The blade touched her skin. At that very moment, an eerie anticipation was transmitted to Christina, but Christina didn't tremble. Allow me to forget this pain and despair so that I bring salvation to your flock. Help them to find rest in your light and allow them to be reborn as light. May you send your light down wherever I am and wherever I walk. As your apostle, I am a lamp that will light up the darkness, and as your torch, please use this body as a source of fuel to illuminate the world. The blade pierced Christina's skin. The pain, so agonizing that her mind felt like it was about to collapse, began to spread throughout her body. However, Christina's tightly closed eyes didn't shake, nor did she let out a groan. So that your light may illuminate the darkness of the world, have mercy on us. Please hear this prayer. Allow your brilliant and holy light, the spark that first lit up this world, to dwell within me, your servant. Nothing could be seen within her tightly closed eyes. Everywhere she looked was full of darkness. Chapter 189, The Fount of Light, 1. Eugene slowly straightened his back. He could feel the throbbing in his head slowly receding, but his eyes still felt quite dry and strained. If he could, he wanted to pull them out and rinse them in water. There are quite a few of them, Eugene muttered while raising his head. He could see about 200 figures moving in the distance. There was no question about it. These were the paladins and the inquisitors. Although the warp gate had been disconnected, it had now been activated. They had come to discover Eugene's presence. They were coming fast, and Eugene didn't want any unnecessary confrontation. However, it was clear that they had no consideration for his wish. Although they wouldn't attack immediately, they were sure to make annoying remarks and send him back. Where am I? Eugene wondered. He only knew that he was somewhere in the mountains but was oblivious to his exact location. However, it didn't really matter. The presence of the paladins and inquisitors was sufficient to hint at the presence of the Fount of Light in the vicinity. The projection from the Holy Grail and the Jawbone had shown an old temple. However, he did not see such a temple in the vicinity. It was expected. Since rumors regarding the Fount of Light were unknown to the public, even the temple was hidden. Eugene raised Akasha into the air. He could see magic permeating the space around him, though it was impossible to understand most of the spells even with Akasha since they were divine magic. It was a complex barrier that combined both regular magic and divine magic. It would be difficult to break through with just magic alone. Then couldn't he simply blast through with force? It was an extremely simple, even ignorant way of thinking, but Eugene did not think long. He had broken down Trescia Cathedral's pillar of light and exited with the Holy Grail and the Jawbone. Then he reactivated the warp gate and arrived in this place, a prohibited area. He had already crossed several lines, so he had no reason to rack his brain over such a simple matter. He did not need to hesitate just because the method was brutish. What is this? Eugene muttered with confusion as he attempted to unsheath the moonlight sword. But contrary to his intention, he found his hands wound around a different sword, the holy sword Altair. It had moved of its own accord and rested itself in Eugene's hand. Eugene frowned as he spoke. You never showed me anything when I wished for it most, so what are you up to now? Who was responsible for moving the sword? Was it the God of Light? If so, Eugene wanted to smash Altair into pieces. He cared not how valuable the blade was nor what it represented. He didn't like it, so he wanted to break it. The things shown to him by the Holy Grail of Anise and the Jawbone of the Saintess had been sufficient. Images flitted into his mind. The river of blood that started to flow from a distant, unknown past, the expressionless face of Anise, the tears that drenched Christina's face, as well as countless girls who would have been there, those whose existences were faint and flitting. An abominable bond. God. Eugene unsheathed the holy sword while gritting his teeth. In one swift motion he attempted to break it by smashing it against the ground. If that wasn't sufficient to shatter it, then he wanted to soak the blade with the blood of the fanatics who worshipped the abominable being as their god. However, just as the blade was about to crash against the ground, a thin light enveloped its body. Eugene was forced to stop himself in astonishment as the light slowly spread from the blade and wrapped around Eugene. The holy sword wasn't the sole object of illumination either. The Holy Grail and the jawbone were also radiating in his other hand. Each of the two holy relics was emitting light as if in response to the glowing sword. Eugene stared at the light for a moment, then proceeded forward with a scoff. There were paladins and inquisitors on guard in the warp gate's vicinity. They belonged to different organizations, but they shared the same mission. However, they were given different orders and different means to execute their mission. Giovanni, one of the captains of the Knights of the Blood Cross, had given orders to politely persuade Eugene to return. Adarix of Malficarum gave different orders. He had served Cardinal Sergio Rogerus for a long time and knew exactly what the man wanted. Moreover, unlike Giovanni, he had experienced Eugene in person. Polite persuasion? There was no way in hell Eugene Lionheart could be persuaded. Although he was perfect when it came to his qualities as a warrior, he couldn't have been more lacking in faith. In addition, he had a rough and violent personality. It was clear to Adarix that he couldn't be persuaded to return, no matter how polite they were. Thus, Adarix ordered the use of force from the outset. They would either quickly suppress and hold him or send him back through the warp gate. It was a rough method, but it was the only method plausible to Adarix. Just when Eugene resumed his steps with the holy sword in hand, 6 figures jumped out of the bushes. 3 paladins in blood cross uniforms and 3 inquisitors in red robes and shakos. None of the faces were familiar to Eugene, but the 6 naturally recognized him. One of the paladins initiated the conversation, Sir Eugene Lionheart. He paused for a moment, feeling a sense of awe towards the glowing sword in Eugene's hand. The paladin felt somewhat puzzled when he noticed that the bowl held in Eugene's other hand was emitting light as well. It wasn't only him either. None of the 6 people imagined that the bowl was, in fact, the Holy Grail of Anise. Even if it's you, this is not a place anyone can just stroll into. Please return. The paladins were never given a chance to finish their words. The inquisitors kicked off the ground, and something reflected the light from inside their fluttering red cloaks. Their ambush wasn't discussed previously and came as a surprise to their associates. Moreover, their movements were far too sharp for their purpose to be considered subjugation. But Eugene did not panic. Instead, he was glad that they had initiated the attack. He did not brandish his sword nor stop in his tracks, even when the inquisitors were almost on him. He had no regard for what abilities they possessed and what they were capable of. Such things meant absolutely nothing to Eugene. Whack. The paladins could only call it simple brute force. There was no technique involved. Eugene wielded extremely dense mana and simply bore down on the attackers. That was all. It was such a simple, straightforward attack, but none of the inquisitors succeeded in resisting. One was swatted to the ground like a fly, another was thrown to the side and helplessly rolled to the ground after smashing against a tree, while the third was hurled back to where they came from. The paladins shifted their stance as they felt a shiver run down their spines. The prayers they recited in their minds gave rise to divine power. The surroundings were quite dark as midnight approached, but the sacred light emitting from the paladins drove the darkness away. However, the light they emitted was tiny and insignificant compared to the light worn by Eugene. The paladins could not move. Was it because their light shone with less intensity? No, such wasn't the reason for the phenomenon. Rather, they could not dare to move. The very thought, the mere idea of moving, had been wiped clean from their minds. The divine power that filled their bodies bestowed them with courage and allowed them to overcome fear. But all was nil when they saw Eugene's face. His face wasn't warped or distorted. On the contrary, he looked frighteningly calm and subdued. However, although his face betrayed no emotions, the paladins felt terrible anger and murderous intent from Eugene. They could not believe that such emotions were coming from the hero. The curtain of light surrounding their bodies failed to inhibit their basic instincts as humans, instincts that were desperately crying out, warning them not to move even an inch. Simply put, they were lacking in determination. The paladins prioritized persuading Eugene through conversation rather than subduing him by force. They had been too soft. So when they came to face him, their minds and determinations bent like reeds in the wind. Eugene's murderous intent was truly ferocious and explosive that the paladins of the Blood Cross Knights, renowned for their unwavering faith, had been forced down and their instincts trampled upon. Gulp. The three paladins did not dare move a muscle as if they were prey before their hunter. They gulped, twitched, and felt cold sweat trickle past the pores on their bodies, until Eugene finally passed them. He made his way through the barrier-protected forest. He had intended to blow the barrier away using the moonlight sword but had been dissuaded by the light of the holy sword paving the way. The two relics in his left hand were still glowing. What blocked his path was an incredibly complex amalgamation of various barriers, and even Eugene's senses were ineffective. He could not tell what was right in front of him. It was as if he was wandering through a thick fog. Well, it wasn't just a feeling. In fact, Eugene was truly walking through a dense fog. He could not tell whether he was walking uphill or downhill nor whether he was really on the right track. Eugene had encountered various types of magic and barriers until now, but never a barrier so powerful. It really would have been the right choice to smash the whole thing, muttered Eugene. However, he did not reach for the moonlight sword. He would not have hesitated if the holy sword had been alone in its efforts to light the path. However, it wasn't just the holy sword that guided him. The Holy Grail. Something felt strange. If the holy sword was the torch guiding his path forward, the Holy Grail and the jawbone in his left hand were. It was as if they were pulling his hand forward, as if they were guiding the way. This, whispered Eugene while looking ahead. Is it a miracle? Eugene hated the word miracle. He had hated it for a long time. People used the word miracle to describe any unconventional, mysterious, and impossible events, things that could not be accomplished by human power. Most miracles experienced on the battlefields tended to be similar occurrences, seemingly impossible battles won, defeating an enemy much stronger than oneself, or surviving in impossible situations. Such were the miracles that Eugene, or rather Hamel, experienced in his previous life. However, it irked Hamel to call such events miracles. Winning an impossible battle? A result of fighting with one's life on the line. Knocking down a stronger opponent? Product of a well-fought battle. Surviving a situation where death was inevitable? Either gratitude was warranted to the enemy for being a meathead who failed to confirm the death, or someone had struggled to save your life. In a sense, couldn't they all be classified as miracles? No. Hamel, I am treating you now because I have the power to treat you. The power I have was given to me by the God of Light, so my existence itself could be proof of miracles. You are free to think as you'd like, but I don't think that way. Fucking hell. We're the ones who struggle, the ones who fight, and you are the one who treats. Why should we have to take it as a God-given miracle? I do not want to argue with you about faith. Hamel, I know you are a persistent, single-minded, stubborn brat like a worm. Did you just call me a brat? All you're saying is that you don't want to admit the miracles of the gracious God of Light, right? You think your achievements are a result of your talent and hard work. That is truly an arrogant. Not me but us. What? We are talented, hardworking, and victorious. We won impossible battles because we fought well, and you are treating me here and now because you're here. Proof of a miracle? What the fuck are you talking about? You're not a miracle but a normal, living, breathing human, aren't you? Huh. What, you got a problem? If you think I'm wrong, go fucking fetch that wonderful almighty God of yours. You can't, right? So why do you keep ranting about some damned miracle and... Then let's put it like this. He could clearly recall Anis's expression from that time. All of this, everything here is not a miracle of God. Hamel, as you say. You know we... No, even that is pretentious. Just... all of us. Right. It's something that everyone achieved together with a sprinkle, just a little bit of God's will. Just a small miracle. Anis had said this with a smile. Come to think of it, that was the first time Anis had conceded in any matter regarding faith and miracles. It was the first time she had backed down and acknowledged even a little bit without pushing her own view. A small miracle. Eugene came to a stop. He couldn't walk anymore. Anis had always spoken about God, light, and miracles. She had always prayed to her God with an imperishable smile. Anis had truly believed in the existence of God. At least that's how it always looked. Anis had been more desperate than anyone else for the existence of God. He had to be. 300 years ago, Anis desired to lead everyone who died to heaven. She declared that she would shed blood on behalf of God and light the darkness on behalf of God. She had declared that she would shine as the most brilliant light after God to bring light to the damned and to lead them to heaven. Sometimes she questioned the existence of God and heaven. Countless people died. The days were filled with suffering and deaths. Far too many people were buried and lands were laid to waste. It was impossible to find anything other than battlefields and the grim smell of death. It was an era where demonic creatures killed humans, monsters killed humans, demons killed humans, and humans killed humans. So Anise doubted the existence of God. The omniscient, omnipotent God was nowhere to be found when the world needed his presence the most. God did not shed blood on behalf of his lambs. God, the so-called light to drive away all darkness, did not drive away the everlasting night of the dark era. Every day the sun gave way to twilight, then once again brought light at dawn, but the world greeting the new ray of sun was absolutely no different from the night before. Despair filled the unchanging days, and just when he was at the brink of collapse, when he no longer had the will to overcome his drunkenness, Hamel acknowledged a miracle of God for the first time in his life. Vermouth. His existence was a miracle of God. God wasn't uncaring and absent. Instead, he was trying to save the world by sending vermouth. That was how Eugene had convinced himself. Anise, Eugene called out. The long, intense battles were always decorated with a drink at the end. When the hellish, torturous battles were over, Anise's back was always soaked with blood. Fortunately, the smell of her blood had been masked by the overwhelming stench of blood from their surroundings. When Anise took off her uniform and showed her blood-soaked back, Hamel saw how her stigmata had spread compared to before. Anise drank when he wiped the blood from her back and applied ointment. "Should I have brought alcohol?" whispered Eugene. But there was no answer. The small pale hand led Eugene. He could not smell blood from the girl. The once blood-stained clothes were now white and spotless. So Eugene wanted to cry. He could not deny that there was no warmth radiating from the hand that led him. He couldn't even feel its weight. Although he could see the fluttering blonde hair and the girl's back as clear as day, he knew well that she wasn't of the living. He did not want to believe that this cruel little miracle was a gift from God. Eugene called out, but the little girl never turned back. She continued forward and guided Eugene to the right path. Though the fog slowly cleared, Eugene did not want to turn his eyes away. He saw the small hands, arms, back and hair of the little girl pulling on his left hand. Would have gone to heaven, right? Please turn a blind eye to this immorality. If you cannot, please bestow the duties to enter heaven upon the shoulders of your servant. Then let us reunite one day in the same place. You've become an angel in heaven, right? Before he knew it, Eugene was no longer walking through the forest. The dream shown to him by the holy sword and the prayer of Anise. If not us, who could go to heaven? It had to be true. More than anyone else, Anise, you deserved to go to heaven. Eugene honestly thought so. He knew exactly the type of life Anise led in his previous life. If not for anything else, heaven had to exist for the sake of Anise. Just as she hoped, she had to have become the second most brilliant light after God to illuminate heaven. We will definitely be able to reunite in paradise. If we do not. Clack. The Holy Grail fell from his hand. Both the chalice and the jawbone contained inside rolled across the ground. Then God does not exist. He found himself somewhere underground following the little girl's guidance. What welcomed him wasn't a hallucination created by the barrier. But Eugene did not want to look straight at the sight before his eyes. He didn't know what to think, what to feel, and what expression to make. Plop. He heard a drop of water and Eugene clenched his teeth. He wanted to avoid the smell of blood. Fortunately, the stench of blood that permeated his sense of smell was his own blood. Blood was trickling down from his peering eyes and pursed lips. Have to look. A voice resonated in his head, his own voice. Eugene slowly raised his head and peered straight ahead. Many pipes that lined the wall were in contact with a spring of water. The water was drawn into a pipe, traveled through its innards through the filter, then fell back into the puddle. The last step of the purification was responsible for the sound of water that filled the space. There were many filters. There were many pipes. The whole process was repeated over and over and over again. The central pipe drew water from the spring and then directed it elsewhere. The scene was truly horrible and reminded Eugene of a pipe organ. A sick, abhorrent mischief of an organ. Eugene raised his head and looked up. He saw the filters connected to the pipes, the white spheres hanging like ripe fruits in the air. Inside the spheres were... What am I doing here? What am I holding in my hand? The objects rolling at my feet, the things in front of me, the things hanging above me. Plop. Somewhere from the pipes, the sound of water resonated once more, and Eugene closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes, countless girls were hanging above the spring. It was still difficult to make out the faces of the girls, and he still couldn't understand why. However, he could see Anise standing upright and Christina crying. Pity. Anise parted her lips. That awful woman. Even now she didn't tell Eugene everything. But Eugene did not crave an answer from her either. The answer didn't matter. It must have been difficult and painful. Even now, said Anise while slowly approaching Christina. Countless girls walked by her side, and one by one they began to disappear. The girls melted away like the snow and became a part of the spring. However, Anise and Christina still remained. Hamel, Anise called out after taking her place behind Christina, who continued to cry. She opened her arms and embraced Christina from behind. What will you do? Leaving behind the dreadful question, the two finally disappeared. Eugene lowered his head. The Holy Grail and Jawbone had already crumbled beyond recognition. What was he going to do? It was definitely something Anise would ask. Although she was the one who wanted something, she would never say it directly. However, right now she did not even need to ask. Eugene slowly raised his head, and a deadly flame engulfed his eye sockets.